Good morning. We are live. Coffee with Rich, joined by Ruedi Kaspar. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, sir. How are you?
Better than I deserve. And Ruedi, as we're waiting for folks to jump on this morning, let's talk about some of our amazing sponsors. The first one I want to talk about is none other than the American Warrior Society. There's our beautiful challenge coin. And it's just a symbol of a commitment to, take care of yourself and your families. It's nothing more than that. These are serialized coins, and then once you become a member of the American Warrior Society, we'll mail it to you as a symbol that you need to be training daily and preparing yourself and your family for your own safety, because sometimes, or more often than not, no one's coming to rescue you. You're going to have to self-rescue, right? Let's see here. Ruedi, you're a member of the American Warrior Society, am I correct?
I am, number 1694.
1694. Yeah, so if you want to find out if becoming a member of the American Warrior Society is the right decision for you and your family, please follow the link that I've put in today's show notes. We've got 6 folks joining us so far. Please like and hit that share button if you're joining us this morning and you are a member of the American Warrior Society. Please tell me where you're joining us from and what your coin number is. My name, of course, is Rich Brown. I'm the co-host, co-founder of the American Warrior Society and the American Warrior Show, America's leading self-defense podcast. And we got a great show for you today. But before we say howdy to all the folks jumping on, let's talk about a few of our amazing sponsors. We got sponsors like PrecisionHolsters.com, maker of the Fast series of holsters, the Mike Seeklander series of holsters, signature series for that matter, as well as the Ultra Appendix, which I wear daily. They also make an amazing tactical belt line of products. So please, if you are in the need of any of those things, please check out all of the sponsors that support what we do here. We also have Mountain Man Medical. Gosh, guys, I can't say enough about Mountain Man Medical. I just ordered 2 more trauma kits from Mountain Man Medical, the AWS trauma kits. And I'll be shipping those to some of the winners of our How to Win a Fight Challenge. We've got another one coming up, so please stay tuned to that. If you missed out on the first How to Win a Fight Challenge, we have another one coming up, and we had 2 winners from that. I'll be shipping out IFAC kits, that's individual first aid kits, co-branded from Mountain Man Medical. Last but not least on today, then I'll talk about the rest of our sponsors at the end, is Cool Fire Trainer. Why dry fire when you can cool fire? That's the way to do it, folks. Cool Fire. It's going to give you felt recoil. It's your gun, your sights. Ruedi, we got a little bit of background noise, I think. I don't know if you can hear that.
I cannot. I can hear a fan running somewhere, but I don't think it's on my end.
Okay, yeah, not over here either. Bob Beal is on this morning. Dr. T.C. Fuller is on. John Shriver, Alan Kelly, Jared out there in Montana says, good morning, gents. Coin number 895. I got a Keen Purefoy. Good morning, sir. Says, good morning, all. Coin number 2441 from Southwest Missouri. Jason Fitzpatrick is on. My brother Jeff Brown is on. He had a birthday yesterday. Happy birthday, Jeff. Ruedi, let's read your bio and we'll get going.
Sounds good.
Ruedi Kaspar is a retired Air Force colonel who spent 28 years on active duty, primarily as a special operations C-130 pilot. His assignments include serving as a squadron commander, vice wing commander, air operations center commander, chief of Air Corps Advisory Group in Kabul, Afghanistan, and commander of USCENTCOM's Combined Joint Special Operations Air Component in Iraq. His final assignment was as Deputy Director of Operations for Air Force Special Operations Command. He has logged over 5,200 flight hours, including combat time in both Iraq and Afghanistan. His awards include the Legion of Merit, Bronze Star, and the Air Medal. He is a lifelong martial arts enthusiast, now training Krav Maga, the owner and operator of Talon Firearms Training in Northwest Florida, and a proud American Warrior Society member. Good morning, and once again, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Rich. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to getting you on, Ruedi. Tell us what that bio overlooks, my friend.
Well, where to start? I grew up in California. I know we'll be talking a little bit more about that later. I joined the Air Force pretty much right out of college, and at least I enjoyed my career. It was reasonably exciting. I think reasonably successful. And the best part was that I'm at least healthy enough to still do the things that I enjoy doing, which these days are martial arts, shooting, a handful of other outdoor activities, and hopefully one of these days getting back to some travel now that COVID seems to be waning a bit.
Yeah, I look forward to that as well. Hey, we've got some background audio that just creeped up out of nowhere. I'm not sure what's going on with that.
I'll go mute on my end. Tell me if it goes away.
Okay. Let me give a test. Yeah, that seemed to be it. Don Bothwell is on. TC says, Cali boys unite. Jeff says, John has a long mustache. I think he's signaling something there, Rudy. Let's see. Ken is on. Says, morning, Rick and Rudy from Destin, Florida. Jared says, do C-130 pilots get extra credit for making troops toss their lunch? I hated nap on Earth. Yeah.
Yeah, I love 130s, but riding in the back of one is absolutely miserable, especially when it's hot and you're doing low level. I've never enjoyed being in the back of one.
No. Will said, I was a C-130 frequent flyer over there. Let's see. Gerald says, coin number 952 out there in Oregon. Good morning. Will Rhodes. Good morning, sir. 19 folks on. Please like and hit that share button. You know, what made you get into martial arts, Rudy?
Well, I had a cousin that came and lived with us for about a year and a half when I was in junior high school. He had just finished his tour in the Army, came back from Korea, and he had been studying Taekwondo when he was over there. I didn't think a whole lot of it at the time, but once I got into high school, I started, I think, getting the itch to do something a little bit different. And since he had studied Taekwondo and there was a Taekwondo school down the street, I started off there, and really enjoyed. I really enjoyed the martial arts experience. I can't say that I enjoyed Taekwondo a whole lot. I'm not a tall guy, and I'll tell you, being 5'7", sparring against folks that are 6 feet and taller, they've got a reach that you just can't match. And so I enjoyed the martial arts portion of it, but Taekwondo didn't seem to be for me. I did a little bit more of it once I got to college, and after actually, interesting story about that one. In college, I had a very traditional Taekwondo instructor, a Korean American, and he told us at one point, if you use your Taekwondo, you've already done 3 things wrong. First, you avoid the fight, then you talk your way out of it, then you run away from it. And if you can't do those 3 things, only then do you use your Taekwondo. So, okay, that makes sense. Avoid the fight if at all possible. So after about the first year, I switched over to Kenpo. There was a Kenpo group working on the other side of the gym. Got over there, and within the first month, he says, if you have to use your Kenpo, you've already done something wrong. I said, yeah, I've heard this before. He said, never use your Kenpo until you run out of bullets. So, being, I guess late teens, I guess at this point that, kind of threw me for a loop for a minute or two. And I said, you know what, they're both right. And yeah, avoid the fight, but if you have to fight, go for it. But the other interesting thing was that he was the first martial artist that I ever met who didn't look at firearms as taking the easy way out, or basically, copping out of, not being able to protect yourself with martial skills, physically. He was the first one that really made it known to me that it was okay to integrate the firearm with martial arts. And today that's relatively common, but back then, that was something that was new. So a little bit of Kenpo, some Jeet Kune Do, back to Kenpo again, and then into the Air Force. A couple of long breaks when I really didn't have time to when I was so busy that I didn't have time or didn't have a good school to study at. But a little bit of Kung Fu, and then finally after all that, after my retirement, found a good Krav Maga school here, and boy, I'll tell you, I'm enjoying that.
Oh, Yeah, I think that's incredibly important to integrate, combatives and martial arts into the firearms piece, and whether it comes before the bullets fly or after the bullets fly, an incredible skill to have because, as you know, we've talked about it multiple times on the show. When they take, they cannot disarm you from those skills, and as Dr. Fuller has pointed out, the more you know, the less you have to carry. So there's an interesting point there. Why did you end up joining the Air Force, Ruedi?
Well, I always knew that I wanted to join the military. My grandfather had served in the Marines in World War I. He was a Tennessee boy who volunteered actually probably before he was legally allowed to enlist, but I don't think they were checking birth certificates at that point. But he joined up. He served in France at the very end of World War I. Still had time on his enlistment, and so in 1919 and 1920, he ended up in Haiti, and spent I think it was a total of about 15 months down there. But good Marine Corps stint, I will say, for him. Unfortunately for me, he was willing to talk about it. He was, or at least, some of his experiences. And so I picked him for as much information as I could as I was growing up. My father served in the Swiss military, first enlisted and then officer. And he was a teenager during World War II and served shortly after the end of World War II and into the Cold War. So he had a completely different set of experiences and a slightly different perspective, but he was willing to talk about his experience. I talked about my cousin who came back and lived with us after he had done a stint in the Army. And so I just kind of grew up, with a family that had served. And so I always knew that I wanted to go into the military. I wanted to fly. So since the Air Force had airplanes, I figured that would probably be the best place to start. And just kind of went from there.
What made your dad immigrate from Switzerland to America?
Oh, he met my mom. She graduated from UCLA, went over to Switzerland on a tour, actually went over to Europe on a tour. And as the tour got to Switzerland, the tour guide got sick. So he called my dad and asked him if he could fill in. So my dad filled in for a couple of days, hit it off, called up his boss, got a week off of work and just stayed with the tour all the way through Germany. So I think after that, my dad was, pretty much, decided that this was the woman for him. And so several years later, he ended up immigrating to the States, and that was where I grew up, and never did end up moving back to Switzerland. My parents did for a little bit, but I've spent my entire life in the States.
Yeah, that's interesting. You and I were talking a little bit about that pre-show. I think that it's not a bad idea for European Americans to take a trip back over the seas and or at least look into some of the push and pull stresses. Now, most people don't immigrate for love. I mean, it's for some pretty dire economic situations or war or famine or whatever, but at least it sounds like yours was a peaceful story.
Yeah, and he enjoyed it. He was a Swiss citizen throughout most of his life. He was naturalized as a U.S. citizen towards the end of his life, and I mean they both lived out their lives here in the States.
And so I know that some of your tours were staff tours at USCENTCOM and the Pentagon. What was that like having as a staff officer myself? That could be hit and miss. It depends on the commander, but what was the Pentagon like? I never certainly been there.
Yeah. The two staff, well, I did 3 staff tours. The first one at USCENTCOM, the second one at the Pentagon, the third one at headquarters, Air Force Special Operations Command. And each one was different. The tour at USCENTCOM, I really enjoyed. I was, at that point, major, I guess, by that point, and still working as a subject matter expert. Picked up a couple of programs that I really enjoyed working with. The simulator training, the SEER program for USCENTCOM, and a couple of other ones, and a lot of travel in there. So there were things that I was passionate about. I got to go travel to some cool places, go see some cool things, and really enjoyed my time there. I felt like I was giving back to the operational forces that I had, spent the first, I guess, 9-ish years of my career with, and trying to make things better for them. But it was eye-opening because now I was being exposed to Army Special Operations Command, NAVSPEC WARCOM, and a bit beyond just Air Force Special Operations Command. So I really enjoyed the tour at USCENTCOM. Back to a flying assignment, and then to Air War College, and then off to the Pentagon. At this point, this was a manpower and personnel assignment. I was picked up out of cycle to go there to fill a vacant spot. And while it was good, while it was a worthy endeavor, if you will, and I was working with good people, my heart wasn't in it, because I was thinking about the folks that were over, fighting the global war on terror. I'd been there about 3 months, and I got an email that said, Headquarters Air Force has been tasked to fill the following assignment: advisor to the Afghan National Army Air Corps. And a little bit of description of what it was, and said, if you're interested in the assignment, volunteer, because there's plenty more coming, and you're gonna get something. So I talked to my wife real quickly, and I said, I want to volunteer for this assignment. She said, yep, I know you're chomping at the bit, go for it. So I typed up an email, and I explained why I was the best candidate for the position. 3 hours later, I got an email back, said, congratulations, you've been accepted. Training starts on Sunday. And so I was off to Texas for pre-deployment training, and then what ended up being about 8 months in Afghanistan, working with the Afghan National Army Air Corps at the time. So to answer your question, my time at the Pentagon lasted about 18 months, but I was gone for 8, almost 9 of that. That was a good experience in itself.
Well, that's a good segue, Ruedi, to tell us about your tours in Afghanistan. Who were you providing support? What were you doing?
Yeah, so I was in charge of an advisory group. So we had a multidisciplinary, group of folks that was working with the Afghan Air Corps to, pardon the pun, to get them off the ground again. To really start bringing the Air Corps back into the fight after the multiple iterations of problems that they had. So they were flying old Soviet aircraft. They had AN-26s and AN-32s on the fixed wing side. They had Mi-17s and Mi-24s or 35s on the rotary wing side, and but they were not integrated with what the ground forces were doing. And so I think I went over there. There were some folks on the ground when I got there. I brought a team of about 30 folks over. And by the time I left, it was up to 115 or so. But we had pilots, we had maintenance, we had firefighters, we had cops, we had medics, we had personnelists. It was across the board, trying to help them really modernize their Air Corps. It later became an Air Force again, but modernize their Air Corps and get them into the fight. The whole logic is, by, with, and through, which is, get the host, I'll call them host nation, but get the host nation to, be able to fight their own battles so that we don't have to be using U.S. troops in order to do it. And they were definitely capable. I mean, they had seen some combat, actually quite a bit of combat over the years throughout the Soviet occupation, and then the warlord period and the civil wars. So they had seen quite a bit. Now it was just a matter of getting them back into the fight, fighting the Taliban, Haqqani, Al Qaeda, all that.
Dr. Fuller says, I rode in a couple of those Afghani hips, scary aviation fuel scented flights every single time.
Oh yeah, it was years before we actually had American advisors flying on the Afghan hips, or any of the Afghan aircraft. And the sticking point was we didn't know the maintenance history of those airplanes. I mean, the Afghans are incredibly resourceful. When a part breaks on an airplane, they'll pull it off the airplane, they'll take it down and have the local auto shop manufacture them one. But you don't know if that meets flight worthiness standards, and you don't know where these parts came from. I mean, some of them were legitimately Russian, some of them were probably fabricated locally, and they just didn't have the we didn't have the maintenance history that we needed in order to reliably put our folks on those airplanes to fly them. About halfway through my time there, we got 4 Mi-17s from Czech Republic, renovated those, and once those hit the ground, we knew what the maintenance history of those were, and we could monitor everything that they had on them. And those we started flying. We started putting American pilots in the seats, letting American passengers ride out. But yeah, I know what you're saying. I mean, yeah, those are some interesting times.
Yeah, and Jeff says, what did pre-deployment for that trip entail? And also, you didn't mention combat controllers and JTACs on your team to help the Afghanis integrate their aviation with the ground, but were they there or not there as part of that?
We did have JTACs and STS, but they were assigned to the ground units. They weren't assigned to the Air Corps. We realized that was a bit of an oversight, but I mean, we were just trying to get those guys flying, responding to requests for support from ground commanders. The focus, I guess, was more on mobility and resupply than it was on actual strike, than what you would think of as air support. So no, they weren't assigned to the Air Corps advisory team, but they were on the ground working with the ground units.
Yeah, that's now, were you, as part of the special operations C-130 that you flew, Rudy, was that AC-130s or what exactly was that?
No, the AC-130s were in our sister squadron. I flew the MC-130s, so those are the ones allegedly is for multi-mission, but those are the ones did a lot of low level, a lot of airdrop, a lot of blacked out landings. We were there to support the rest of the soft forces. So Army Special Forces, Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, the special tactics guys that embed with them. That was our reason for existence. But yeah, we were there to get them in, resupply them, get them out, type thing.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's see. Tony says it's called winging a prayer for a reason.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Dr. Fuller says maintenance history. Now that's a euphemism I never saw when concerning the Afghans.
Yeah, I use that term loosely.
Mm-hmm. So, as far as did the fall of the Afghanistan government as speedily as it fell, was that a surprise to you, having served over there?
Yes and no. And I'll say this, I was over there. Okay, so the first tour was working with the Afghan Air Corps, the by, with, and through, piece, really trying to work with the host nation. The second tour that I was more on the direct action side, and so that was where we were just providing the air power to do the things that the American forces needed to get done. But on both of those tours, I mean, I was, part of the leadership process. I, attended the staff briefings, and I heard, the briefings on how the U.S., or more accurately, the coalition, planned to win, whatever that means, the conflict in Afghanistan, and to succeed over there. And I, I bought into the strategy. We've got the special forces teams that are out there in their hamlets, probably not the right word for Afghanistan, but in their hamlets, working with the locals, showing them how life is better when they're not under the control of the Taliban. The ink blot mentality, or the ink blot strategy, where they're bits of freedom and democracy, or at least autonomy, are expanding. So, and then the advisors that I already talked with, trying to strengthen the government and the military. So doing that on the one hand, and on the other hand, using our I'll call them counterterrorism forces, but basically our direct action forces to build some breathing space for the forces that were on the ground, taking out the bad guys so that they couldn't disrupt what we were doing. And it seemed in 2006, 2007, and then again in 2010, like there was actually a chance of that strategy working, that we could make some lasting gains. I left Afghanistan in 2010, and yeah, it was a kind of a long steady decline, after that. So was I surprised at how quickly it fell? Yes, in some respects. I would have thought we would have been talking about it much longer and having a much more orderly pullout. But I think once it became inevitable that we were leaving, the rest of the coalition would go with us. The Afghans are survivors, and they know by that point that if the Americans are leaving, that that's the losing side of the war. So, the ones who could, probably blended in with the population, shifted over to the other side. The ones who couldn't, tried to get out. I'm not surprised that it once we announced it, I'm not surprised that it happened that quickly.
Yeah. And as far as your tour in Iraq, were there any similarities or stark differences between your time in Iraq versus your time in Afghanistan?
I saw a different slice of the pie when I was over there. The headquarters was in Iraq, and I had forces in Iraq. I had forces in Afghanistan, so I ended up doing a lot of flying in between the two. But we had folks in Pakistan, we had folks in Yemen, we had folks in Jordan and UAE, and so kind of traveling to see them on an occasional basis as well. But what I saw was more narrowly focused. Everything I saw there was focused on the direct action fight and us getting the what we call violent extremist organizations, the VEO, the terrorists, bad guys off the streets. Although I will say, empowering the Afghans and the Iraqis to do it as well. And so it wasn't just U.S. forces going in to take out the bad guys. It was U.S. forces working right alongside their host nation counterparts. And the Iraqis had had a different mentality than we did. We normally inserted by air. The Iraqis were much happier going in by ground, going in by truck to hit the objective, and it worked for them. They did well with it.
Part of your time as a squadron commander, did you enjoy command or your staff assignments? What did you prefer, Ruedi?
I honestly, I think I enjoyed the flying assignments the most. The first 3 assignments I had, that was just young and unafraid, and running around the world and having the boss hand you the keys to the plane and getting to go do good things. Those were the really exciting times. I did enjoy the staff tours from the perspective of giving back to those operational forces, and the leadership tour. Yeah, leadership is rewarding. Some of it is fun. Some of it is frustratingly, amazingly frustrating. So did I enjoy my time as a squadron commander? I did. I was at a training squadron out in Albuquerque. So I had 4 years, 2 as an ops officer and 2 as a squadron commander, working with the students. And so, contact with the students one-on-one virtually every day. And I've always enjoyed instructing. I really enjoyed working with those guys and trying to bring my experience, the experience that I had gained over 3 flying assignments, trying to bring that back to the students. I had an incredible group of instructors out there, and I think we did a really good job. That the training, the training function is often given second billing to the operational function, but it's part of the foundation. You've got to be pumping good men and women out to the units if you then want them to be able to execute the mission. And I think we did a good job. I did enjoy the flying out there. I did enjoy the instructing. There were some long nights and dealing with the stuff that a commander deals with on a unfortunately too regular basis.
That's funny. For those that have been in the military command, it's amazing that, at least in the Marine Corps anyway, that 10% of your troops seem to suck up 90% of your time.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do.
There's problem children in every branch of service, I'm sure. I forgot to put this on our show notes, Ruedi, but I wanted to toss this at you as far as, because you're now a firearms instructor and you were an instructor in the aviation community, special operations aviation community. And I want to throw this out there to you, sir. What makes a good instructor, in your opinion?
Yeah, you've had some really good answers to this with all the guests that you've had on your show. Well, when I was going through Air Force instructor school, we said that the three pillars of good instruction were fear, sarcasm, and ridicule. And once you mastered those, you could teach just about anything. But honestly, for me, the answer would be empathy. If you can put yourself in the shoes of your student and figure out what it is that they understand and what it is that they don't understand, and that they don't realize that they don't understand, I think that goes a long way towards actually sharing with them, imparting the knowledge to them. For me, it's empathy. Just trying to figure out what the student is thinking. Both in the airplane and then teaching basic firearms instruction. I've had some students ask questions that I never thought to ask, and some of them are enlightening, and you go, oh, I can see why you think that. That's something that I wouldn't have come up with on my own, but let's talk through that.
That's an interesting thing to say, empathy. I don't know that I've heard anyone say that, and I would tell you that to the Marines that are watching or listening to this, I think if you asked 100 Marine instructors, you would never hear empathy.
Oh yeah, I hear you. You probably wouldn't hear that from Air Force instructors either. But
I think it's a great. But the way you use the term makes 100% sense to me. You have to be able to put yourself in the student's shoes, and if you lack that ability to do that, then how are you ever going to impart the information to them?
Yeah, I remember, pulling my hair out a couple times, going through initial C-130 training. Is something I just did not understand. I could not make sense of it, and finally had an instructor, say, okay, walk me through what you're thinking. And as I explained it to him, he said, okay, here's the deal. He goes, you're thinking along these lines. I want you to, put all that in a bucket, somewhere, and now start thinking along these lines. Look at it from this perspective. And once I could change my perspective, start looking at it, all of a sudden, the light bulb came on, and I was able to, pick up what he was trying to impart.
For me, I don't know if I've ever told this story. For me, there was a moment when I was a combat instructor at the School of Infantry. I'm a early, maybe 24-year-old sergeant, and 3 deployments, and I thought I knew everything. And we had a mass casualty situation. It's cold weather related, to be completely frank about it. But we had a lot of guys get hurt and a lot of guys in the hospital. And I remember when they started filtering out of the hospital from hypothermia and stuff, there was a few parents that came to visit them on the weekend. And I remember there was one student that I thought was absolutely worthless, beyond worthless. And like, man, we need to get this guy to the Marine Corps. But to see his family show up that Saturday when their son got out of the hospital, and and their loving embrace and the tears, and I'm like, man, it cemented the point to me that every one of the students under my charge, someone loves them beyond words. And it's a solemn oath to be that person that's going to train that young warfighter, whether it's an aviator or a grunt, it doesn't matter. And if you don't perceive the solemn oath that the country has entrusted to you and those families that entrusted to you, and whether it starts with empathy or whatever word you want to put on it, I think shame on you, man. You need to turn in an AA form and move to another unit. You're not the right person if you can't do that.
Yeah, I agree. Like I said, you get out what you put in. And if you put good instructors at your training units and they have the latitude to actually not just meet the requirements of the syllabus, but actually teach the student what the student needs to know and work with them on the things that they're having trouble understanding. If you can do that, then when that student gets out to wherever their next assignment is, whether that's an actual cop on the streets, whether that's, someone in the military at an operational unit, whether that's a civilian, now carrying a gun, in public to defend themselves, now you've actually set them on the right track, and you get out of it only what you put into it.
Yeah, and we had a saying that I think is true too. Train hard, fight easy. Where the
Exactly.
training should always be, of course, you can never simulate, the casualties and the blood and your loss of friends and the all that other stuff. But what you can simulate, you really need to do it. I want to get a couple of questions here, Ruedi. My brother Jeff says, in your opinion, could the Afghanis that you worked with easily assimilate to a life in the United States?
Yeah, good question. It depends on what their experience was in Afghanistan, as what walk of life they came from. Um, there there are some large class disparities in Afghanistan as well. It was interesting. The My first 7 weeks over there, I stayed at a place called Camp Eggers, and Eggers was built in what was formerly a very upscale neighborhood. In fact, if you read the book Kite Runner, that's where that area is where the first portion of the book actually takes place. I mean, large houses, with servants' quarters and really set up for what I would say the upper class of Afghan society. So if they came from that portion of society, perhaps, I think that they would have an easier time assimilating. If they came, from some of the more impoverished portions of society, yeah, I think they're going to have a more difficult time. It also depends on where they end up in the United States. If they're trying to assimilate in Detroit, or if they're trying to assimilate in some portion of I don't know, Miami or something like that. But it depends on who they are and where they're headed. But it's going to be an uphill battle. I mean, that's definitely two different cultures.
Yeah, I remember I was on uh, a scholarship selection board, and one of the other officers on there with me was a female major who had went to, it was an Ivy League law school, and she was a JAG officer in the Marine Corps, and she was saying she was on some assignment in Afghanistan, and they said, Major, whatever her name was, she was an Asian officer, like, Major Kim, I need you to do us a favor. You need to go talk to General Azad. We got a problem. Like, what's going on? He's like, he cannot keep a boy chained to his desk and rape him all day long. You're going to have to go in there and talk to him. And, we can't have that. And, so I think, and she was like, what? So sure enough, she says, I go in there and he's got this little boy wearing makeup handcuffed to the foot of his desk. And it's like, we can't have this. So I say that because a lot of Americans never hear those kind of stories when it comes to cultural assimilation. I don't know that it was ever going to be possible for us to win that in one or two generations. This is a multi-generational problem, or at least in my estimation.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I take this with a grain of salt. But on one of my trips over to Afghanistan, I ran into a buddy as we're boarding the C-17 and heading over there, and he handed me a book, a historical fiction book called The Afghan Campaign. And it was written from the perspective of a foot soldier in, I'm pretty sure, Alexander the Great's army. And his march, I'm going to put this in air quotes, but what he experienced as he was marching, across Eastern Europe and finally into the Middle East, finally ending up in Pakistan. And again, it's historical fiction, so part of it was written knowing what we were going through in Afghanistan at that time, but part of it was based on historical research. And the things that the Western culture experienced in Afghanistan 1,000 years ago are pretty similar to the things that the Western culture experienced after 9/11 when we got over there. And yeah, Alexander wanted to change it. The Brits wanted to change it. The Russians wanted to change it. We wanted to change it. And as I think as TC said in the last week, well, our assumption is that everyone up to this point has just done it incorrectly, and we're going to do it correctly now. But boy, I mean, that was a big assumption going in, that we would be able to stay there for 20, 40 years, whatever, and introduce the Afghans to democracy, and they would just lay down their tribal affiliations and rally to this cause of Afghanistan as a country, putting that ahead of their familial and tribal loyalties. And boy, were we wrong on that? I read an essay by Ralph Peters, who a former Army Green Beret, and he wrote quite a bit after. He still, I believe, writes quite a bit after, now that he's out. One of the things he wrote was about an alternative approach. What he would have recommended was wiping out the Taliban, going in hard, wiping out the Taliban, and then pulling out completely and turning it back over to the Afghans and saying, you let the Taliban come back in, we'll come back in again. But until then, it's your country. Figure out how you want to run it. In hindsight, that makes perfect sense, and I wish we had gone down that road, but we didn't. We decided to try to change the culture, put more and more troops and introduce them to democracy in the Western ways. And 20 years later, we're realizing that didn't happen. That didn't work.
I do respect and like Ralph Peters, and I've enjoyed a lot of his writings, but I find that kind of thought a little bit misleading, because it's as if, well, the Taliban, they're just a different kind of person. They've got different kind of heart and lungs than we got. No. It's like Solzhenitsyn said, if only it were as easy as to go find and kill the evil people doing evil, insidious things, but the evil resides in the heart of all men. Or I'm butchering his quote, but so to think that you can never root out a cause. I mean, I think the struggles in Europe show that these damn Protestants, we gotta kill all the Protestants. Is like, well, good luck with that, because they're making new ones every day.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
It's a bit of a to me a non sequitur that to think that you could do that, because it's I just don't know how you root out an ideology. And as TC mentioned, it's only been done correctly maybe in Kenya with the Mau Mau. Other than that, I don't know of any other coin strategy that worked.
Unless you look at the Brits and Malaya, they had good success there. And I don't know that he was necessarily saying we could root out an ideology, but I think he was saying we could knock them back to the point where the other forces could at least control the country, or large portions of it.
Yeah, I mean, they would just, I would imagine, run over the mountains into Afghanistan, and like they did with us, train and fight and re-equip and then slink back in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tony says, did you get to pick the aircraft you flew, or were you assigned? That's a great question.
A bit of both. There's a long story behind everything. C-130 was my first choice coming out of pilot training. I wanted to work with the Army. I think just because of the experiences that my grandfather, my father, and my cousin had, I just wanted to work with them. And there were other places I could have gone, but that was my choice. And I'll tell you, after several years, I realized it was my niche. It was really what I was. I ended up in the right place, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And I wouldn't go back and do it any differently if I had it to do over again.
Ken says, present company accepted. Ruedi Kaspar is the most knowledgeable and professional firearms instructor I've ever had. I learned so much from him every time we go to the range. So
I really appreciate that. Ken's a buddy of mine. Met him through Krav Maga, and we've been shooting quite a bit. And I enjoy shooting with him as well. Ken, thanks very much.
And Will says, reminds me of one of my mentor's teachings, quote, "It's not only to be understood, but not be misunderstood." Yeah, I think I might have known that guy that said that quite a few times.
Spot on.
Alan says, empathy is a good analogy. We all started out with little or no training, so it may be with your students. You have to work with their lack of knowledge or experiences. Yes. And of course, Chad Ray says you can't wipe out an ideology, and Chad was a SOCOM civil affairs guy working on the ground with indigenous forces. So
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you for everything you've done for us.
Let's see. Justice, sorry for the question. Is Kaspar a common Swiss name?
I think so is the answer. Yeah, it has been for the last, several hundred years. I know that there are lots of folks from the Czech Republic or of Czech descent that also have that same last name. I think if you go back far enough, it was probably Bavarian, but who knows, 300 years ago, or 400 years ago, how how the tribes, the families, mixed and blended. But yeah, I mean, definitely Germanic, possibly Czech, but for since the early 1800s, my father's family had been in Switzerland.
I want to move on to one of the questions that I really was looking forward to hearing the answer to, Ruedi, and that is, you recently attended the Global SOF Foundation's Special Air Warfare Symposium. What was some of the threats they discussed? Of course, I'm assuming China, Russia, North Korea. Tell us a little bit of whatever you can about that symposium, sir.
Yeah. Number one, I think this was my first experience with the Global SOF Foundation. That's a civilian commercial. I mean, that's a company, but they did well, and I really enjoyed it. We had a number of guest speakers from a number of different walks of life, and I learned I think quite a bit from them. Yeah, you hit it on the head. The way that one of the presenters described it was the 2+3 mentality, or the 2+3 threats for the future. So China and Russia and being the two major threats, and then North Korea, Iran, and violent extremist organizations, VDOs, being the other one, or being the third of the 2+3. So I think nothing unexpected when you put it in those perspectives, and then it was just a matter of kind of diving more deeply into some of those threats.
As far as what keeps that organization up at night? Is it cyber? Is it nukes? Is it what are they worried about? Influence, finance? I mean,
yeah,
all the above.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I think the shortest answer would be the multi-domain approach that China is following to expand its influence. So, they're working on the artificial islands in the South China Sea, from a geographic perspective, from a military perspective, the modernization of their military forces, the incredible cyber capability that they have, the Belt and Road initiative, where they're working their way into the fault line spots around the world, and the influence that they're gaining out of that. It goes back to the white paper that was written in the 90s by the Chinese War College students, talking about unrestricted warfare, and how warfare is not just military on military. It's any tool at your disposal. So attacking an enemy's banking system, attacking their stock market, attacking their electrical grid, all those are all valid targets when it comes to war. So that this what came out of the Chinese white paper, the concept that China has at least mentioned, if not espoused recently, of lawfare, where using the world's legal system to bind your opponent and put them in a position where they're spending so much time and effort and money and are hamstrung by the lawsuits that are out there and the legal actions that they're having to fight, that they are losing advantage relative to I'll say you, but what I really mean is China. Just a multidisciplinary approach, and the fact that they don't seem to be buying into the productive world order philosophy. I mean, every country does what is beneficial for itself, but I would say the one thing that the U.S. and our close allies don't do is we don't sacrifice an orderly international order, if you will, in order to get it done. And the Chinese seem quite willing to throw that out the window. You talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. One of the things that was interesting to me was it's not just a matter of getting into Africa or places in the Middle East or South America to get their minerals, tap into their mineral resources. It's also restructuring their debt and then putting them making them indebted to China, so that when China decides to take Taiwan or whatever, it's not just China that gets, how do I say that? When the United Nations censures China, it's not just China voting against it. It's a block of 30 other nations that are in China's pocket voting against that as well. So it's the political, I call it political, but it's basically the international, capital that they're making on the UN stage as well, as they burrow their way into some of these countries. Anyway, bottom line, a very intricate, multifaceted approach, and I think that's what keeps most of the folks that I had a chance to talk to up at night.
Yeah, it's exactly what Will and I have been talking about as well as on the Emerging Threats series, and that is, the debt trap diplomacy, I think is what you're alluding to, Ruedi.
Thank you. Yeah, well said.
Yeah, China's a master at that, and as they continue to gobble up countries in that regard, we need to, because okay, yeah, we're going to do this deal and you're going to be on the yuan, or you're going to take payments in the yuan and get off SWIFT. I mean, we are a waning empire. You heard it here first, folks. We are on our way out. Watch that Ray Dalio, a 45-minute video presentation he's got on YouTube right now. And I don't know how you can come away with the data, any other assumption than we are a waning empire. It's something to keep in mind in the future. And it'd be interesting to come back 200 years from now and read the books that are going to be written on this period. I think it's going to be pretty interesting. Don says China's expanding control of natural resources around the world, including here in the U.S., is going to become a major financial hurdle for us in the next few years. Yeah. And what did Biden say yesterday? That food shortages are going to be real in the foreseeable future. Well, yeah. Again, we've been talking about that here on Emerging Threats. It's just a simple math problem. If we're not getting the fertilizer we need, then crop yields aren't going to be what they need. If we're not getting the amount of fuel we need because we've cut our own throat with an executive order, then there's really no mystery here, folks. It's that gas prices are going to continue to rise, and without the fertilizer, it's going to be a problem. So, and moving that food to where it needs to be, distribution centers or processing that food is price increases are coming, folks.
Yeah, and I think there are. Well, number one, I appreciate all of the work that you and Will and TC have put into this. I'll tell you, I've listened to probably not all, but most of the interviews that you have done. The podcasts that you guys have done, and I really appreciate the work that you guys have put into that. I realize that seems like a pretty likely glide slope that we're on, a likely course of actions. There are wild cards out there. China's population is declining, and that's going to pose some very interesting problems for them. China is unified in that 92% of the population, I think, is Han Chinese, and they've got the Central Communist ideology. But beyond that, there's not a lot of philosophy that really binds the Chinese people together. And I think there are some potential catastrophes that could be awaiting the Chinese government. I have a friend who retired as a general in the Royal Australian Air Force, and I got a chance to talk with him a couple years ago. And he said he had been at the Australian War College when they had a Chinese gentleman, high-ranking Chinese general come through, and he said some very interesting things. And one was that if you look back at the history of China, it is a boom and bust cycle in terms of power. China, completely disorganized and not able to project power at all, up to a peak where they're basically in control of everything that's within their realm, and then a rapid drop off. And he left them with the question, where are we now on this boom and bust cycle? I don't know. They could be, approaching their apex in the next 50 years, or something could happen that that shifts it, and China falls apart from the inside. So I don't know. It's certainly discouraging right now, but I think that there are other eventualities that could come to play.
Oh, you're 100% correct. And just because America's waning now doesn't mean that in 200 years we're back on top, because you're right. It's not just China that rose in these cycles.
No, it's not.
It's all world empires. So Diego Delgado says, what would happen if the U.S. defaults on debt to China but continues to pay other countries? That's a great question. And I don't think we would ever do that, because the minute we don't service the debt, and it's easy to service the debt, we're servicing the debt in dollars. Where other countries have gotten in trouble and defaulted on their debts is they said they would service their debt in another country's currency that they don't control. Here in America, this is why people say deficits don't matter. We say we're going to service the debt with dollars that we can print at will. But the problem is it devalues the dollar every time we go on a mass printing spree.
Yeah,
Well,
that's a great question. That is kind of a nuclear option. That is something that that people have talked about in the past, especially with regards to some concerns of, I'm going to say 20 years ago, it's still a concern today, but foreign entities buying up huge tracts of American property and American land. And that kind of putting us over a barrel in what I will call peacetime, but that could be nationalized, if it came to, if push came to shove. But like I said, that is the nuclear option. I think it's an option, but we're headed for some tough times if we choose to take it.
Yeah, it would be. Will says China's acquisition, we talked about that, I believe. Yeah. Final straw in world conflicts, savage, unrestricted warfare. Yeah. Jeff says, what are your thoughts about controlling a no-fly zone over Ukraine? Well, he just went there, didn't he?
Yeah. All right. So my thoughts on Ukraine and Monday's show with TC, I thought was excellent. I'm actually looking forward to next Monday's show. Putin's view of history and how that might explain a couple of things. So since you asked, Jeff, here are, I guess, my thoughts on Ukraine. I don't like what's happening in Ukraine. I feel incredibly sorry for the Ukrainian people, and I wish there was a way to kick Putin out and, with his tail between his legs. Unfortunately, I don't see the Ukrainian conflict as being winnable, whatever that means, by either side. I don't see Russia being able to take all of the territory that they want and being able to control it and then hold it. I don't see Ukraine being able to take back all of their territory and kick the Russians out completely. So what I see happening as this whole thing plays out is probably a divided Ukraine, and it pains me to say that. I've got friends who are Ukrainian. One of my buddies has got a sister and a young child in Kyiv that can't get out. Another friend from Odessa whose family is scattered, through Kyiv and the Donbass and some other places, and has lost contact with a lot of them. So it pains me to say that, but I think the most likely end state for this whole thing will be something along what we saw happen with Germany at the end of World War II, divided into East and West, West friendly with the West, East controlled basically by Russia. I don't know how much territory that's going to be. I don't know if it's just going to be the Crimea and the Donbass, or if it's going to go all the way to the river that divides Ukraine and Kyiv, pretty much in half, or something in between. But I think that's probably more likely. So as miserable of an outcome as that is, and as hard as that is on the Ukrainian people, I do think it's preferable to us lobbing nukes back and forth with the Russians. And I think we need to do everything we can in order to keep that from happening. So I think a no-fly zone enforced by NATO would be going too far. I completely support sending them as much arms and munitions as we can. To me, that includes the fighters that Poland has proposed giving them. I'm not sure how much good that will do, although they do seem to still be in control of some of their air bases and with runways that aren't too pockmarked. So hopefully the Ukrainians could make that happen. I could see giving them air defense systems, but having NATO go in and enforce a no-fly zone, I think that takes us, past the what was considered acceptable in the proxy wars of the Cold War, and puts us in direct conflict with the Russians. I don't know. That's my opinion, and I realize that there are lots of other opinions out there.
Yeah. Tony says, what you're proposing sounds like a new Berlin Wall.
I'm not proposing it. I'm saying I think that's a likely outcome. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, Kyiv divided like Berlin was. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about this, and I'm going to shift back to Ukraine. But one of the questions I do have is, when you look out into the future for the next 50 years of SOF or aviation's role in the SOF community, what if anything do you see there?
Yeah, good question. So we tend to think of things in the West as either peacetime or wartime. Wartime is firing artillery shells, whatever, shooting back and forth at each other, and peacetime is friendly competition. I think that we are going to spend much more time in the gray zone between those two, where we are in conflict, but not necessarily in an all-out shooting war with that. Well, at least with China and probably Russia, North Korea, Iran as well, but primarily China. We're going to, be in that gray zone, and the objective isn't going to be I think their objective and our objective both is not necessarily going to be to win outright, but it's going to be to gain advantage in those gray areas. The same way that they're, burrowing their way into the economies and governments around the world. They're gaining advantage, and that's where I see a lot of our effort needing to be placed. So the challenge becomes, how do you do that? And I think that SOF is going to play a pretty important role in that around the world. In planning, you've got to plan, disaster preparedness planning or military planning. You've got to prepare for the most dangerous scenario, which in this perspective would be, large scale peer-to-peer conflict, us versus the Chinese, us versus the Russians, whatever. And the military is very good at gearing up and preparing for that. Buying new aircraft carriers, buying more F-35s, developing the B-21 bomber, more brigade combat teams, preparing for that force-on-force conflict. The problem is you also have to prepare for the most likely scenario, and the most likely scenario is lower level conflict in that gray zone. Military, the big military, I'll call it, Big Blue Air Force, Big Green Army, they pay great lip service to it, and it sounds great on paper. Oh yeah, conventional forces can be used to conduct unconventional warfare type or irregular warfare type operations. The problem is when it comes to actually funding and funding them to do that and tasking them to do that, every bit of funding and every bit of tasking takes away from what they see as their primary mission, which is preparing to fight that big war, the peer-on-peer conflict. So, you know, the Air Force talks a great game about preparing for irregular warfare, but with the exception of the forces cut to USCENTCOM, it usually just doesn't happen. An Air Force example is we've been talking for years about having a light attack capability. You know, Super Tucanos, or, you know, some type of single engine propeller driven, you know, airplane that can orbit overhead and you know, and provide strike, you know, on call for the folks that are on the ground. But, you know, we're not putting a dime towards that, because every dime we put towards it takes away from F-35s. Every pilot that we put in that takes away from, you know, being able to fill F-35 or F-22 or C-17, you know, cockpits. So anyway, probably a longer description than I thought, but yeah, the conflict in the gray zone is where I see the vast majority of our operations in the next 20, you know, 50 years. And now it's just a matter of making sure that we prevail when we do end up competing there.
When we talk about soft aviation, you know, in the role of drones going forward, I mean, as a pilot, does that kind of concern you that we're moving more into the drones, or is that a good thing?
I mean, there are pros and cons to everything. I remember my mom telling me when I got, you know, my pilot training slot that I was going to be the last generation of manned aircraft. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And she's like, you know, autonomy is coming. They're all going to be flown, you know, by somebody on the ground, you know, by the time well, not all the airplanes, at least not yet, but we are certainly headed that direction. No, I think that most pilots these days are very comfortable with that, with working in the airspace with remotely piloted aircraft. You know, so folks either remotely piloted, where you've actually got somebody on the ground controlling it and working alongside you. We did that all throughout Afghanistan and Iraq, and it was very effective. But also, you know, now we're looking at autonomously flown aircraft, where they're actually, you know, flying themselves and making decisions for themselves with minimal input from humans. But it's coming, and again, you know, it keeps us from putting humans in harm's way. That's a good thing, but it takes the human out of the loop, and once there's a danger to dehumanizing warfare. You know, that would be the downside of it.
Yeah, I think it was the Navy's Pegasus drone. I think was the name of that. Maybe I'm completely wrong with that, but it could take off and land on an aircraft carrier autonomously. And, you know, there was some thought to giving it autonomy over, you know, firing. And it's just like, no, guys, that's.
Yeah. And yeah, the human in the loop, you know, before you actually launch the weapons, you know, right now that's too far. Right now, that's something that current leadership's not in mass willing to do. But I'll tell you, I mean, I see it coming. I mean, look at those little robotic ground. This is redundant. Those little ground robots, you know, that the Army is working with right now, that it can send in. You know, that identifies a target and engages it with, you know, virtually no human in the loop, or at least that's the concept. So, you know, first there, and then, you know, perhaps with the airborne drones after that.
Yeah, you know, I did a show on the danger of AI a year or two ago, and I had my son write a line of code on the blackboard, and behind me, I'm like, if you were a coder, can you spot the error? Because one string of code said, you know, good morning and welcome to Coffee with Rich, and the other one said, good morning, terminate all who come to watch Coffee with Rich, or whatever I wrote on the board. And like, can you spot the thing in time? And there's several instances. If you could Google around, you can find it on the internet. I spoke to a few of them. One was a South African artillery battery that was using AI, and as soon as one fired, the other one swung over and fired on it and perceived it as a threat. And, you know, killed I don't know, I think 8 South African artillerymen. And then there was one that they were showing off in Iraq, and a gunnery sergeant tackled the robot before it could fire on a crowd at a viewing of dignitaries. So obviously the technology is not there yet. Maybe it will be there, but I think science fiction writers have been writing about this autonomous killing machines for quite some time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let me, if I could, over to Diego's question about why are militaries no longer looking for outright victory.
Mm.
I don't mean to give that impression. I think that when it comes to war, militaries are still looking for that. They're looking for, I would say unconditional surrender of our enemy, but we didn't even demand that in Iraq when we kicked out Saddam Hussein. So, take it with a grain of salt. But we are looking for victory. I think the point was that short of war, there's going to be an awful lot of conflict. And that is not a traditional win or lose proposition. It's more of a mindset of gaining advantage over your adversary, creating dilemmas for them, creating advantages for yourself. Rather than outright victory, and perhaps that's because the cost of getting into a shooting war and having that escalate is just prohibitively high.
Yeah, and I'll take up Delgado's point because I think he's right, and I agree with you too. I think the military are looking. I think it's a civilian leadership that has put the reins on that. Whether you go back to Korea, and we were fine with leaving the 38th parallel and just kind of walking away, and I think that's where, like your point about Ukraine, that's what we may see there. That the Dnieper, or however you pronounce that river, splitting Kiev, may end up becoming some sort of dividing line akin to the 38th parallel. But it seems that we are willing to wage war now with no clear end state that includes an unconditional surrender, to borrow your phrase.
Yeah, and again, I use that term loosely. I'm not sure we've demanded unconditional surrender since World War II.
Mm-hmm. No, well, we saw it in the Gulf War, I think, which is interesting.
We did, but then we didn't force him to give up his military. We didn't force him from power. And
Was that coalition driven, do you think?
No, I think it was. I think it was an oversight on the. I don't know. My opinion. I don't have any inside baseball on this, but I think it was an oversight on the part of our political military leadership. I say political military. Our national leadership. We didn't think that we needed to do that. We thought that we had. We thought that we had won. It goes back to what you and Mike were talking about the other day. Why do good people lose fist fights? Well, oftentimes it's because they get one good hit in, they get one good punch in, and they believe that the fight's over. I think we did the same thing. I think we got one good hit in, and we said, therefore Saddam will know that he has been defeated, and so we didn't demand that he leave power. And just like World War I leading to World War II, that brought us back to, from Desert Storm, that brought us back to, I don't know, post 9/11.
Yeah, we talked about that. Yeah, you're right, man. Johnny says, thinks there's no more trench war. Thankfully, there's no more trench warfare due to COVID and social distancing.
There's pros and cons to everything.
And he's tongue in cheek, but what's funny about that is, we're seeing trench warfare right now, which is amazing to me. In 2022, trenches forming and have been forming, whether that was in the Donbass region or where we're at now. And it's so surprising to me that you can have that. Don says, because politicians and industrialists don't want it. I guess he's talking about outright victory. Says victory implies an end to hostilities and reduces the downstream need for more weapon system. That means big bucks lost. And you could make a compelling argument as to what Don is saying. A friend of mine who's in the healthcare industry and has been for a while, I said, why have we not had a cure for cancer or something? Because there's no money in it. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, well, no money in the cure. There's money in treatment, but there's no money in cure. So why would you ever fund that? And he looked at me like, why would you want to find a cure?
Yeah, there is some truth in that statement. I think that it definitely drives. It is one of the drivers behind why we prepare so hard for the highest end of warfare, the peer-to-peer, conflicts, is because that's where the big bucks are. That's where the big weapon systems are. I mean, this is only one of okay, this is only one of multiple reasons. So my number one rule is that nothing significant happens for only one reason.
Agreed.
There's always a variety of things that come into play, and we have to figure out which ones the most important reasons, or the controlling factors. The corollary to that is there's no silver bullet for complex problems. There's no one thing you can do to make a conflict, or well, to make a problem go away. Anyway, I see this as part of the problem when it comes to preparing for the high end of war and ignoring what's much more likely, which is going to be conflict in the gray zone.
Yeah. And to Bob's point, Bob says, I don't think the pharma industry would agree with the no money in a cure for cancer theory. And he's potentially right. But I will tell you, I circle back to what you just alluded to, Rudy, and that is there's no such thing as a single variable causation. It's always multivariable causation. And it could be that one of the variables towards why we don't have a cure for cancer is not really money in it. I mean, there's money in things like solving erectile problems and SSRIs and things of that nature. There certainly is. I mean, you can't look at the stock sheet on these companies.
Yeah, I'd like to think that somebody could find a way to make money out of a cure for cancer, but yeah, you may be right.
Tony says politicians don't prosecute wars the way warfighters are taught to prosecute wars.
Yeah, you're right. They think differently, and I'm not sure that's a bad thing. The first approach to solving to solving an international crisis should be through diplomacy. I would much rather have the politicians sort it out than have to put Americans in harm's way. But yeah, you're right. At some point, the only way to fix things is to take out the bad guy, and sometimes we get hamstrung, with overly restrictive ROE and limits on winning the battle, but losing the war because we don't plan for the peace afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Now, I wanted to get into something this morning too, Rudy, something that I am completely unfamiliar with, and that is Dan Millman's The Way of the Peaceful Warrior. I'm sorry, sir. What exactly is that, and what impact has it had?
Yeah. Okay. So, as I told you, this is the first time I've ever tried to put this into words. So, forgive me if I stumble, just a bit with it. So pretty early on in my career, I was over at a friend's house, and she had a copy of Way of the Peaceful Warrior, Dan Millman's book, Way of the Peaceful Warrior, on her bookshelf. And I was reading the back cover, and she said, "Have you read it?" Nope. So she gave me the book, and I read it and just loved it. It really, really struck a chord with me. So I picked up some more of his writings. He's actually written, I think, 19 books now, a mix of fiction and a lot of nonfiction, which are generally classified as self-help or whatever. But he's written actually quite a bit. I picked up a number of his books. I picked up some, let's say how old it was, but picked up some audio tapes, some cassette tapes, that he had put out, and enjoyed that, and found out that he did some in-person training. So I attended a couple of his training classes. He's an incredible person. He's a genuinely good person, just kind, but strong, and with strong convictions and the willingness to act. And he's had a pretty big influence on my life. So if I was to try to put the philosophy into words, it would be approaching life from a centered perspective, where you're not tossed by the waves of life as the challenges, kind of come and go, where you've got your rock center, and you can, weather the storm in a peaceful and centered manner. And doing that by approaching it from the position of action. So taking responsibility for what you do, and being proactive, not reactive, being a warrior in the sense that we all need to be strong in order to survive, compete, thrive in the world that we live in, but doing it from a peaceful perspective, so that you're not, so that it's not a constant struggle, so that it just flows much more easily. And so one of the things that I ran into, I've always been relatively, safety and security minded. That was just the way I grew up. And I think, probably the way that I'm wired, but I always felt like there was a bit of an edge to it. I always felt a bit on edge, and not completely relaxed. And he was the first person that basically said, to me, you can be calm and centered, and yet, aware of your surroundings, prepared to defend yourself, and able to execute, whatever it is you need to execute in the moment of truth. I don't know. He can do a much better job, than I can describing the philosophy. But in a nutshell, that would be it for me.
No, I like it. I don't disagree with anything you just said as far as that goes. I mean, I don't feel keyed up. I feel completely relaxed because I know my capabilities, right? And now, if you're untrained and you're unarmed, whether that's mentally armed or physically armed, then to just, I'm really cool, I'm really chill, I'm a peaceful warrior. Are you really? But if you are armed and you do know what your capabilities are.
Yeah, there was definitely a reassurance that comes from being prepared. And I have, seen that in myself over the last, 4 years that I've been a member of the American Warrior Society, and, and the effort that I have put into it. I feel much more prepared, much more secure now. Dan Millman is an accomplished martial artist. Early on he was studying Aikido and a couple of the other ones. Last time I saw him, he was studying Sistema, and for a variety of reasons. But he's an accomplished martial artist, and he is very capable of defending himself. I guess I would say. But there is more to explore beyond just being well prepared. So I was trying to come up with examples yesterday as I was thinking my way through this. Somebody cuts you off in traffic. We know, the American Warrior Society, our group, we know it's not personal. Whatever, that the guy's having a bad day or whatever, cut you off in traffic, and we know to have the appropriate reaction, which is, give him some space. Don't flip him the bird. You don't need to lay on your horn, flash your lights, because the next thing you know, it's going to end up with, drawn pistoles, and, you're going to be fighting it out on the side of the road. So, okay. But there's a level beyond that. I will tell you that, oftentimes when someone cuts me off in traffic, I feel that blood boil up. I mean, I'm not gonna ram his car, but boy, I feel it. How dare you, cut me off? I'll tell you that Dan comes at it from a much more centered approach, which is, relax, let it go. A lot of people are having very bad days out there, and he doesn't necessarily get that same emotional response that I think I still do, when my blood boils. And anyway, all I'm saying is, it works for me on an occasional basis. I would, if it sounds like something that might work for you, I'd encourage, people to check it out. But it's definitely not inconsistent with the American Warrior Society philosophy.
Well, I will definitely check it out. I have not. I've heard of it for years, but I've never actually sat down and read it. So I'll go to Amazon and go ahead and buy me a copy and check it out. I kept you on here almost an hour and a half, Ruedi. Thank you so much for your time, but I do want to get your thoughts on the current state of world affairs, sir. And please feel free to take that and go with it wherever you'd like. And the follow-up question, if you want to add this in there, would be, what is a reasonable, responsible, armed citizen, American Warrior Society member, for example, to do about the world affairs as we see them?
Yeah, we've talked through a lot of it already. That the conflict with China. I will. All right, I'll go out on a limb here. I'll talk real briefly, if I can take just a second to talk about something that one of the guest speakers at the seminar talked about, and that was a different approach to addressing the North Korean problem, and with the end in mind that we are, quite frankly, trying to create dilemmas for China. That is what they're doing for us, and that's what we need to do for them in this this level of conflict below war, but above peaceful competition. We are in the business of creating dilemmas for the Chinese. One of the ways to do that would be to change our relationship with North Korea, or at least the position that North Korea holds in the world. So what I mean by that is what the gentleman had suggested was a different approach rather than trying to isolate North Korea, force them to give up nuclear weapons, and then only after that bringing them onto the world stage, would be to do it the other way around. Number one would be to form an alliance in the Pacific somewhat akin to NATO, where it's a mutual defense treaty. So you start easy with the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. And I realize, there are problems with Japan and South Korea, the concept of them coming to each other's aid, with the history that they share. But look at how powerful NATO has been, and look at the hurdles that we overcame, building NATO. So step number one, this gentleman proposed, was, build an alliance somewhat akin to NATO in the Pacific. Bring in the Australians, bring in the Singaporeans, but that mutual defense treaty. Number two would be to make North Korea's relinquishment of nuclear weapons an end state rather than a precondition to actual negotiations. It hasn't worked yet. I don't know. We've been doing the same thing in Cuba for 60 years, and we haven't had much luck with Cuba. Perhaps with Cuba and or North Korea, it's time to take a different approach. But start normalizing relations with them, bring them into the fold. Step three would be to flood them with MTV, Coca-Cola, Burger King, whatever it is, but Western culture. Give the North Korean people a taste of Western culture and show them what's on the other side of the DMZ there, because that's how you generate change, from the inside. So I realize that there are problems with each of those steps, but if you were to do that, if you were to bring North Korea into at least the sphere of influence of South Korea and the United States, rather than just the sphere of China, imagine the dilemmas, the problems that would create for China, having North Korea right there on its border, 2 million ethnic Koreans living within China. I mean, that would be a significant problem for China. Anyway, not without its cons, not without its problems, but perhaps there's another solution there. Anyway, the state of international affairs, beyond that, I see the conflict with China being the big one over the next 50 years, and we have to find a way between us and our allies to prevail in that. And we've talked our way through a lot of that. What can an individual person do in order to be more prepared, to be safer? I guess I'll take the Dan Millman approach, on this one, or perhaps it's the Stephen Covey, approach. It's simple. 2 steps. Number one is come up with a plan, and number two is execute it. So coming up with a plan, take 30 minutes, write down, and I realize I'm preaching to the AWC, or the American Warrior Society, choir right now, but to anybody else that listens to this, take 30 minutes, write down everything that you've thought of. I want to learn to shoot. I want to learn to defend myself. I want to get in better shape. I want to learn, I want to take a wilderness survival class. I want to learn how to can tomatoes. Write it all down, put it in a list, prioritize it. And then step two is start executing it. Pick one that's important and let nothing get in your way. Start ticking items off of that list. Incredibly easy to say, incredibly difficult to do, but that's the only way I know of getting it done, is making that plan and then just finding the internal fortitude to actually execute it.
I love it. Prioritize and execute. Yeah, totally agree with that. Anything, where can folks find you, Ruedi, or if they wanted to train with you, where would they need to go?
Probably the easiest way. So, I teach a small number of relatively, small classes. It's word of mouth and local area kind of stuff. My specialty, or at least what I've been concentrating on this point, is really, taking folks to the range for the first time, teaching people who have never handled a gun, who have never owned a gun, how to shoot, and giving them a positive, enjoyable experience at the range, making them competent to own a firearm, and hopefully, give them some interest in carrying one with some further training. So where can you find me? www.talonfirearmstraining.com. And that'll take you, these days, that'll take you to my Facebook page, that you can get a hold of me there, message me or email me or whatever. That's probably the best way to get a hold of me.
All right. Ruedi, thank you so much for being on the show this morning.
Rich, thank you very much for having me. You have had an incredible series of guests on this show. I'm honored that you asked me to be here today. Like I said, you and Will and TC have done so much good work on the CWR side, bringing issues to light and really diving into them. And you and Mike, for what you guys have done for the self-defense community, it's absolutely amazing. So I'm proud to be a part of it, and I appreciate everything you guys have done.
I'm honored, sir. A couple of final closed things before we close out this morning is, if you are American Warrior Society member, please check out the preparedness series on the left-hand side of the page. When you get into the Training Vault preparedness series, it's where we break down the go bag, its purpose, how to construct one. We give you a shopping list, everything you need to construct a go bag. Please check that out. If you're having a problem, if you're trying to get access to it and it says restricted access, that's a problem internally that we can fix for you. So just email me, rich@AmericanWarriorSociety.com. We'll get you taken care of. Got two more sponsors to talk about this morning, Ruedi. Then I'll let you enjoy your day, sir. That's APPHemp.com. CBD products are some amazing products. If you haven't tried them, I highly encourage you to do so. They have everything from propagation to product over at Appalachian Standard. Jesse and I served in the Marines together. He retired as a gunnery sergeant. Him and his family are craft artisan hemp growers. Please check out APPHemp.com. All of our amazing sponsors. Go to AmericanWarriorShow.com. You can listen to all of our previous podcasts, or you can click out and support the sponsors that make everything possible. Last but not least is the Bob XL by Century Martial Arts. You can work on your edge weapons. You can shoot Bob. He's a great three-dimensional target for 5.56. He is also amazing. I'm looking at Bob over there. He's got a gi top on him, Ruedi, and I was hitting on him with a kendo sword yesterday for some reason. I don't know why, but
mine's waiting for me in the garage. I got the vest, and I've been doing arm traps on him lately.
Yeah. Let's see here. Bob Bill says, thanks, Ruedi and Rich. Gerald says, thanks. Thank you, Ruedi, for everything that you do in our community, sir. And thank you for giving us your time this morning.
Absolutely, Rich. Thanks again so much for inviting me to be here. I appreciate it.
And remember, folks, the fight is coming. Be ready.